think philosophy is in many ways the greatest discipline, because I think it's one that has a sort of optimum combination of rigor and precision matched with of artistic creativity, because we have to come up with arguments, we have to create arguments. That philosophy is a creative process, and yet it's also got this, or can have the same level of rigor as mathematics or physics.
So welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Stephen Mumford. He is currently head of Department and Professor of Metaphysics in the Department of Philosophy at Durham University. He is best known for his work in metaphysics on dispositions, laws, and related topics, although he has also made some contributions in the philosophy of sport. His books include, but are not limited to, Laws in Nature, Getting Causes from Powers, Metaphysics, a very short introduction, Causation, a very short introduction, Watching Sport, Aesthetics, Ethics and Emotion, and others. He has a variety of published articles as well, but and feel free to add anything else. But with that, welcome Professor Stephen Mumford.
Hello.
Awesome. So I think one thing that I want to get to talk a bit about is some of your views on emergence. But before that, maybe as a preliminary to that, I had some questions about your views on what causation is, what powers are, and those are the sort of concepts that are used in your account, I take it.
Yeah.
So maybe as a start, what do you think a decent account of what causation is amounts to? Do you have a account that you start from there, or what can you say about that?
Well, it's difficult to know where to start, isn't it? So I'll try and start very generally, and then narrow it further and further down as I go along. So I'm an anti-Humean on matters of causation and most other things. So I take it that causation does involve a stronger than purely contingent connection. So I'm a causal realist. I'm also a causal primitivist, so I don't think causation can be analysed into something else that isn't causal. So I think power, or causal power, and cause amount to pretty much the same sort of thing. So I've got a powers-based account of causation that was developed in Getting Causes from Powers with Rani Anyam. And powers, we take it, are things that we can know about because we're causal agents ourselves. We exercise our own causal powers, so that's where we get an idea of power from, which answers one of Hume's challenges. Now, I think many anti-Humeans fall into a trap of defending a claim that's not defensible, which is that the way in which causes produce their effects is by necessitating them. So because Hume denies natural necessitation, some anti-Humeans think that they have to defend natural necessitation. But in Getting Causes from Powers, we claim that the cause tends or disposes towards its effect. On some occasions it produces that effect, but it doesn't do so through necessitating it. So it's a non-necessitarian but non-Humean primitivist account. I hope that's useful.
Yeah. So when you say a primitivist account, do you mean that the concept is in a way primitive, or the thing we're denoting is in a way primitive? It's not reducible to something else, or perhaps both?
Well, maybe both, but I think we were thinking more of the former, because because I don't know how I could apply a notion of primitive to things that exist.
Right.
There is the question of whether it's reducible to something else, and I don't think causation is. But I do also think it's conceptually primitive, because I don't think we have any more fundamental concepts than causation, and I don't think we have other concepts that are lacking causation that are going to be identical to causation. So, to take the Humean case, I don't think causation reduces to constant conjunction, and perhaps more in answer to some contemporary views, I don't think causation reduces to counterfactual dependence between events either. So I think in another book we've got called Causation in Science, we sort of depict things like that as symptoms of causation. So they can track causation to an extent, so they can be used to identify causes, but they don't track causation exactly. So you could have some causes that don't involve counterfactual dependencies, and some counterfactual dependencies that don't involve causation, and so on. So there's a rough overlap between causation and some of those other things, but I don't think that they're exact.
Fair enough. I was wondering what you think of maybe the following sort of approach to what causation is. So perhaps we think that we don't start with a sort of well-formed conception of this relation, that is, in terms of a list of necessary sufficient conditions. We also don't start with some sort of primitive concept, but rather we start with a variety of causal judgments that we use to sort of populate our concept in a ostensive kind of way. And then, as a matter of theorizing, we take it upon ourselves to abstract away from the concept so defined a description in terms of necessary sufficient conditions, and we may in some cases revise our concept so as to incorporate those descriptions. But what's really forming the concept in the first place is the sort of individual judgments. We see billiard balls, and okay, that's the sort of thing I'm calling a causal relation. We see other things and then abstract principles away from that. What do you think of this sort of approach?
I think that sounds pretty good, in that I think there is a sort of serious question raised in Hume about how we acquire the concept. And
Right.
I think we do acquire it through experiencing it. Where I would disagree with Hume is, I also think that we experience it directly through our own bodily senses, through proprioception, through acting, and so on. So I think we will have lots of individual experiences of causation that way. And certainly I think of sort of the token case as primary. The token case is what we're going to experience, and then we can sort of ascend to an abstraction, the notion of cause in general. So I think that sounds fairly consistent with what you've said there.
Right, and you've noted that at least sort of the traditional Humean approach might suffer from issues of singular causation, that it doesn't seem to adequately explain them. You think that's right?
What? So, well, I mean, I would be happy to allow a case of causation that was an entirely singular instance. So there's a part at the end of Hume's treatise which I've sometimes cited that I don't think gets mentioned very often because it's not in book one, where most of the causation stuff occurs. But there's a section near the end where he discusses whether God could have created or caused the universe, and he says we could never form that judgment because it's entirely a singular occurrence. So it's not as if there's an event of one type followed by an event of another type. these are both unique instances. And he says, so we could never form the idea that one caused the other, because you haven't really got a constant conjunction. Constant conjunction requires more than one instance. So that's the case where, you know, as a causal realist, I am happy to allow that you could have a case of causation that was entirely singular, a unique occurrence.
Fair enough. So, Dog had some questions relating to causation. On the point you brought up about how we have a sort of direct experience of us causing things or playing causal roles, he says, I don't see how our causing things is going to be an argument against Hume. After all we see or have experience of is some volitional state followed by a desire, which is itself followed by some physical act and other states of affairs. So maybe he might draw this sort of Humean line and say, you still don't see the cause, you just see the different states that occur. So what do you think about that?
That's exactly what Hume says. Yeah, he anticipates this sort of objection and applies the same kind of analysis. So he says all you experience is a constant conjunction between a willing and an acting. But I think that that's an implausible account of agency that sharply separates the volition from the act. So I think it's quite implausible that an act of willing occurs in the mind, and then it's followed by the action or the bodily movement. Now, Hume, of course, needs that in order to apply his standard analysis of causation, because, well, for Hume, the cause has to be temporally prior to the effect. That's how we distinguish cause from effect. It's the temporal priority. Whereas I think in agency, the willing and the acting or the bodily moving are going to be simultaneous. So if you think of my willing to lift up a book, so I'm actually doing this now. I've got a book in my hand. I decide I want to lift the book up high in the air. My willing to do that must continue all the way through the act, simultaneous with it, because if at some point I decide to bail out from the action, decide I can't be bothered doing it anymore, then I'm not going to carry on with the action. So it's what I think is we need to sort of reunify the willing with the acting and accept it as a kind of single unified experience instead of something where there's a sharp separation of the mental and physical components. So I think you could answer Hume along those lines. I think he's tried to anticipate this objection, and this is a possible source of knowledge of causation. But I don't think it succeeds. And this is also a case where I think that sort of discussion gets hampered by the fact that we don't usually acknowledge all the sense modalities that human beings have. You know, so we're probably taught at school that there are 5 senses. But there are a lot more than 5 senses, and in the case of causation, the primary sense, I think, is proprioception. So this is a kind of sense of required effort that you have when you're lifting something, and it can sometimes be surprised if you go to lift something that's heavier than you're anticipating, or even when you go to lift something that's lighter than you were anticipating. And I think this is this kind of strain, muscular effort, sense of required effort is going to be crucial in our perception of causation. So there's some stuff by Ducasse in the 60s, I think, where he thinks that we can actually see causation just using the sight. You know, so if you see one billiard ball move towards a second and the second moves away, he thinks that that's seeing causation. Now, I wouldn't think that that was a direct perception of causation. I think the concept is going to be acquired through sort of more intimate bodily experiences than that, but then can get extended to those other instances.
All right. Do you think that the effect can ever precede its cause in time, or is that something ruled out sort of conceptually or metaphysically?
Well, that's an issue that I've not worked on, and I'm saying that because I know it's a very tricky issue, and I know it could
Right.
involve some a posteriori points in physics which I don't know about. But I've sat through talks by Phil Dow and Hugh Price, and there are some people who think that there can be backwards causation and that certain theories in physics require it. And if that depends on some a posteriori premise, then I don't feel in a position to tackle it. So
plausibly, it's not something that's decidable a priori, then, or by just.
well, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, I've not really studied this, so I mean, it's just what I'm thinking now. But I think if you have a concept of causal production that you're realist about, and I don't see that kind of immediately rules out a priori a case where the effect precedes the cause. Whereas there could be some theories of causation that just immediately, you could say, hang on, a priori, I know what you're saying is false. See, and I don't think I'm in that position, and I don't think I've got a concept of cause that obliges me to say that.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree. Although maybe we could say something to the effect of, at least generally speaking, effects precede their cause, and maybe that's not merely some sort of contingent fact, but that's follows sort of from the concept, or maybe not. Would you be willing to commit to that?
Well, I can't quite commit to that anyway, because I've got more of an Aristotelian notion of cause, which involves simultaneity of cause and effect. Now, there are
Right.
so there are some extended causal processes that give us this appearance. So I think if, say I put a sugar cube in my coffee, and I think that the sugar cube being in the coffee causes it to dissolve, and its being dissolved happens 30 seconds after it's first immersed in the coffee. And that, I think that's the sort of thing people are thinking of when they think the cause precedes the effect. But I think it's possible to understand a case like that in a different way, where the causation begins as soon as the coffee and the sugar are in contact. But it's a process that then unfolds and takes time. So it's a process lasting 30 seconds where we're going from a solid in a liquid, and then less and less solid as it goes into solution, until we finish with a point where it's all in solution. So I say this is Aristotelian because I think it's a bit more kind of substance causation rather than event causation, which I think is part of my kind of general rejection of the Humean framework. So a Humean would say they try to articulate that case as something like the sugar cube being put in the coffee at time t1 causes the sugar cube to be dissolved at time t2, which is later than t1. But my friend and colleague John Hyle said to me once, the sugar being put in the coffee is not the cause. The sugar being in the coffee is the cause of its dissolving, and being put into the coffee is just the story of how it got there. It's the story of how it got into the coffee. It doesn't really matter how it got there. The causation begins as soon as it's in there. But I think it's standard to articulate it in that way because Humeans and many other people have an event ontology. They've got an ontology that prioritizes events, as anyone in a broadly empiricist framework will. And so they have to sort of tell the story so that the cause sounds like some kind of event. Whereas the way I would understand it is the sugar cube being in the coffee is when the causation begins, and that sounds more like a state of affairs or something, or it's two substances acting on each other. So I accept that the way I see causation is kind of it's unorthodox in a way. It's swimming against the tide, maybe harking back to an Aristotelian or even Thomist kind of view. But it's I've never been afraid of being in a minority in philosophical views.
So to be clear, then, these sorts of things that causation takes as relata are states or states of affairs, or can it take other things, agents, substances, events? Are these things ruled out?
Again, that also becomes that becomes a bit tricky, a little bit tricky, because I've just as I was arguing for a kind of unified theory of agency. I think I've also got a sort of unified theory of causation, where it's kind of unitary and process-like, which might mean it's not really a relation. So what it really is, what's going on, is that powers are coming together and mutually manifesting their effect. So mutual manifestation is a notion taken from Charlie Martin. To stick with the previous example, the sugar cube has a power of being soluble, and the coffee has a power of being a solvent, and they're not going to do anything or act on anything until you bring them together. And then their mutual manifestation is then a process which takes time and involves a change, and it kind of runs its course. So there's a phrase in Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles where he talks about a power or a cause sort of seeking its end state, which I know it sounds very teleological, which I'm not really going along with, but I like the idea that he then describes that end state as the point beyond which the cause seeks nothing further. So you bring the sugar cube and the liquid together, they go through this process of dissolving, and when all the sugar is dissolved, then seeks nothing further. There's no further change unless you were to introduce some further causal power that produces another mutual manifestation.
All right. And actually, just two more quick questions about causation, and then I want to talk about emergence, if that's all right. So
Yes.
This was also something from Dog, and it sort of relates to, I think, when you were saying about the sugar cube and the coffee, in a way, in that, well, the act of putting the sugar cube in there isn't the cause of its dissolving.
That's right.
It's being in there is the cause of its dissolving. Is that to deny that causation is transitive, or are we just going to say it's not really relation, so these sort of considerations don't come up? Because after all, if it were transitive, the act of putting it in there is the cause of its being in there, and it being in there is the cause of its dissolving. So it being put in there would be the cause of its dissolving, right?
Yeah, so technically I think that causation is non-transitive. So it's not intransitive, but it's not transitive either. So I think that's what you should say if you've got a theory of causation based on powers. Because I think the key thing comes down to a cause is something that disposes or tends towards its effect. Now, you could have one cause that produced something, but then the thing that's produced then tends in a totally different directions, such that you couldn't say that the first cause produced the third thing. So that sounds complicated. Let me give you an example. So you could have a fire in a building, and the flame causes the sprinkler system to come on, and then the sprinkler system causes the fire to go out. Now, I don't think we should say that the fire then causes itself to go out, because a fire doesn't dispose to itself going out. Fire usually is going to spread, I think, depending on the circumstances, but it seems misleading. So there's a reason why I think the first cause tends in one direction, the second cause is tending in a different and opposite direction. And another test of this kind of account is, suppose I were to raise my voice unexpectedly, and then if you think, well, the world just consists of all these transitive chains of causation, there's a question then: did the Big Bang, the very first event, cause me to raise my voice at that moment? Well, I would say definitely not, because I don't think the Big Bang had any tendency for me to raise my voice or to lower my voice at that time. I think it was didn't dispose me in either direction at all. So that's another instance for why I think it would be right to deny kind of universal transitivity. Of course, there are transitive cases, which would be ones where there's a disposition through a chain or process. So there can be some processes that go through intermediate steps. You could think of like biological processes, for instance. So it could be some chains of causation such that if A cause B and B cause C, it's also true to say A cause C. But I think there are some instances where you would deny that.
Yeah, fair enough. And just a final question on just causation itself. Suppose someone just didn't share the concept that you have, or the primitive concept, or they thought that it's not really relevant to sort of theorizing about the world. How would you go about trying to convince this person?
Oh, that's a hard question.
Yeah.
It's a very hard question, because I don't think it could be done easily. I mean, I'd have to find out exactly what the sticking point was. So I think we would have to do it through discussion, and I'd have to find out exactly what their issue was. But I would just say in general. So this is something that I've taken from the introductory chapter of Phil Dow's book on physical causation. I think the sort of ordinary concept of causation that's in common usage could well be a complete mess. So if somebody just comes and thinks they've got some pre-theoretical intuition, I don't know, it could be that absence is a causes, or that causation is transitive, or whatever. Well, that may well be the case, but I want to do a kind of philosophy that regiments the concepts, that's prepared to challenge common sense. So if somebody comes along and says, well, I think that absences are causes, for instance, then we'd have to argue it through using sort of standard philosophical tools. I'd produce a reductio, for instance, and then we could take it from there.
Are you saying in the cases where the sort of folk notion might turn out to be an absolute mess, that we should dispense of that notion and maybe devise, sort of engineer a more sensible or straightforward or useful one philosophically, or that we should?
No, I don't think we're quite doing that. I mean, I don't think it would be the business of philosophers to just go and tell ordinary people in the street to revise their concepts. I think, I mean, this is getting into a very big question about what the role of philosophy is, and is it an antidote to common sense, and then is it just for purely philosophical purposes? in conclusion of the first book of the treatise, Hume talks about this kind of problem, because he admits that when he leaves his study, he kind of accepts causation just as much as anybody else, and he'll go and play billiards with them, and and he'll forget all his doubts about inductive skepticism. So it might be that there's a bit of that going on, that as philosophers, our concern is with a sort of coherent view of the world that all fits together and makes sense at an abstract level, and it may well leave everything else untouched. It may well leave ordinary usage of concepts untouched. But I think that's the way it is. We're often ignored, aren't we, as philosophers?
All right, that's helpful. So we'll move on. I think Shinichi had a question you wanted to ask in voice. If you want to unmute, you
can you hear me?
Hello.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for doing the AMA. I actually had two questions. They were both basically about dispositions. So in some of your work, you mentioned something like dispositionality, at least to some extent, is unanalyzable, in the sense that when people
Yes.
try doing different sort of conditional analyses, like simple conditional analysis or like Lewis's, and I think Michael Farah has one, they all sort of don't work. So I wanted to ask, do you think when people, I've seen sometimes people say things that like, well, there's not going to be a really simple sort of conditional analysis or some sort of reduction to categorical properties, but all we need to know is that at least one exists, and that we can just dispense with dispositional talk, because really it's just going to be really complicated, like categorical basis talk. Do you think there's any sort of hope for that kind of view? I guess that was my first question.
Yeah, but so let me just get clear. So are you saying people want to eliminate disposition talk,
Right.
and they're just happy to think, well, there's got to be some kind of conditional analysis ultimately?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some serious questions, I think, about why disposition talk is so undesirable in the first place. So the first person I think who really tackled this was Hugh Mellor in his 1974 paper was it called In Defense of Dispositions? He's just asking the question, why is disposition talk so undesirable that philosophers want to reduce it away? Now, there I think it gets us into some really interesting questions that I'm hoping to tackle before I retire. So I've got my last 4 books all planned out, and I'm hoping to tackle this kind of issue. So I think that there is a kind of metaphysical prejudice in favour of a sort of atomistic, disconnected, disjointed world. So we see this in all the empiricists, for instance, who start with sort of discrete units and then try to find any connections between them. And I think that this might even have a sort of political or ideological basis to start by seeing the world in that way. So we find it in all the great empiricists. We find it in Locke and Hume, and we find it in Hobbes and Bacon. So if you take Hobbes as Leviathan, for instance, he starts with an account of society where it's discrete individuals with their own sort of particular aversions and desires. And then he tries to sort of build up a political system from that, and tries to build up a view of society from that justifies an absolute monarch, because we're all selfish individuals, and if we don't have an absolute rule over us, we'll all kill each other. And that kind of misses the social postulates. It misses the idea that we're already related to each other in a society, and everything we do is so related. And I think the kind of Lockean and Humean metaphysics is buying into that as well, that it starts with a world of discrete, distinct existences, which, you know, and everybody will know it now from Lewis's Humean Supervenience, the world of just distinct existence as one thing and then another, and then try to build up the causal relations from that. Whereas I think Hume's like, consider Hume's billiard table, and he says, oh, all he sees is one billiard ball move and then another, and he's kind of looking down on the world as some kind of godly observer, able to just see these distinct existences, and he's not accepting that he himself is causally involved and part of the world, and he should put himself in the position of the billiard ball, sort of already connected. So I think that the sort of powers disposition view is kind of starting from a premise that the world is interconnected, and seeing it in terms of discrete, unconnected things, which could be an antecedent and consequent condition in the conditional. Now, that's already an artificiality, and I think the empiricist, by getting us to start with that world of discrete, distinct existences, sort of already they've made their key move, and if we accept that, maybe we're already committed to the program. Whereas, so I'm hoping to do work in the future to challenge that initial key move.
Oh, I see. Thank you for answering. I just had a second follow-up, kind of in the same realm. You also talk about sort of, and I think you mentioned this before actually, in this AMA, where you think that when we do like a modal analysis of dispositions, we shouldn't be committed to like necessity, but when we talk about possibility, we mean a kind of different kind of possibility. So something like, if X is disposed to Y, then it seems right that X is possibly Y, but not the other way around. So just by going from possibility, we wouldn't be able to get a disposition. And I think you give an example, it's a bit hazy now, but I think you give an example like, just because it's possible that, for instance, I snap my finger and a chicken materializes, that doesn't mean me doing that disposes that to occur. But I guess my question is, one, could you maybe talk more about this sort of modal analysis, but also in the sense of like, if we're in a possible world where that thing does happen, where, you know, snapping my finger does cause these sorts of things to happen, why couldn't someone just say that there is a disposition, it's just a very unlikely to occur disposition, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think that last point is a tricky one, but I'll try and get onto it. So, yeah, for anybody who doesn't know, one of the most challenging or original things that I've come up with in this book with Rani Anyam is this idea that causation involves this sort of third modal value. So it's not pure contingency, it's not mere possibility, nor is it necessity either. It's a kind of intermediate modal value, which you could call tendency or dispositionality. So the sort of example that we give in the book is, when you strike a match, it has a disposition or tendency to light. Clearly, there's no necessity that it lights, because we all know that we've sometimes struck matches and the match is not lit. But it's more than pure chance that it lights when it does light. And indeed, we know that because the reason we strike it is because we want it to light, and we know that that's the way to get it to light, because we know the match has a disposition to light when struck. And it doesn't have a tendency when struck to evaporate or turn into a chicken, as you say. So this is what we could call it sort of natural possibility. I mean, people have tried using that kind of notion for a while. But yes, there is a problem that, I mean, the theory of the natural world might tell you that, well, perhaps there is a disposition of a struck match to turn into a chicken, but it's just a very small chance. And I'd accept that to an extent, because powers can come in degrees. So some powers can tend quite strongly towards their manifestations. Some can tend only weakly to those manifestations, but sometimes even the weak tendencies can be significant. So if I said, "Oh, take this tablet," and there's only a very weak tendency towards death, only 1 in 1,000 people who have the tablet die. Well, that weak tendency would nevertheless be very significant. So you'd want to avoid it. Now, I strongly suspect that the correct theory of the natural world tells you that there's no tendency at all of struck matches to turn into chickens. But occasionally I hear someone who says, well, in quantum theory, blah, 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 maybe it's just a weak tendency. Well, if that were to be the case, I think I'd be tempted to revise the theory slightly and say, well, what we're really interested in our theory of the natural world is the non-negligible tendencies. So I think it could be that there's no tendency at all, but it could be just such an extremely weak tendency that it's not the sort of thing that we should really worry about. But it makes the theory messy, so I'd rather that not be the case, but if it is the case, I have to accept it.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I want to talk about a little bit about emergence, and I think what I'm going to do is sort of briefly state the definitions given by David Chalmers, and then maybe we can talk about your causal transformative model, and sort of you can situate that in opposition to, if it is with this. So he says that a high-level phenomenon is weakly emergent with respect to a low-level domain. When the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are unexpected, given the principles governing the lower-level domain. And he says that a high-level phenomenon is strongly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain, but truths concerning that phenomenon are not deducible, even in principle, from truths in the low-level domain. So I guess, what do you think about this approach to emergence, and how would you situate your account in relation to it?
Well, it's not the account of emergence I'd go along with. So I would say, and this is a relatively recent development, because I'd not worked on emergence before, but I was persuaded that I should be an emergentist, that it sort of fit the theory. And then I sort of looked at some of the existing accounts, and I realized that one reason I hadn't subscribed to emergence before was that I wasn't really satisfied with those as accounts of emergence. So I think part of the trouble with the emergence, it's a very young concept. I mean, I think it first appeared in philosophical literature only about 170 years ago. And I'd been working on causation for a lot of my career, and that discussion's been around for millennia. So I think part of the problem with emergence is that it wasn't even clear what it was an emergentist was accepting, that a reductionist was denying. So I think this is an area where there is still quite a lot of the basic conceptual work to be done. Now, what I don't like about the Chalmers view, I mean, it's right in some respects. It's enough for us to get started. But I don't like the idea of the difference between weak and strong emergence ever ultimately falling on any epistemic concerns. I'm a metaphysician rather than an epistemologist, so maybe I'm always going to say that kind of thing, but I want to know what sort of real emergence would be in the world. So I don't see it should be just a question of whether we can predict or deduce one thing from the other, whether that's the higher level phenomena is just surprising, or whether it's deducible in principle. I mean, there could be some of that, but if they were, I think that would piggyback on the kind of metaphysical facts of the matter. But when it comes to sort of my own view on emergence, which I've started working on recently, but I'm hoping to do more work on this in the future. So it's far from a polished theory. I haven't got a book on emergence yet or anything. So one thing I'm quite attracted to is the idea of a theory of emergence that is consistent with naturalism. Now, the reason I say that is because I think some of the early emergentists, such as C.D. Broad, it starts to look like a bit of a desperate position of how mind just kind of magically emerges from body. And maybe you can use this in some defense of dualism, for instance. Now, I think there's no reason to go that way, because to me it seems quite plausible to me that if we found exactly how mind emerged from body, for instance, or if we found how life emerged from lifeless parts, or how free thinking things could emerge from non-free things, then I think when we get that explanation, it's quite plausible that it all be perfectly naturalistically explicable. So if somebody's currently working on a project of how mind emerges from matter, I think that actually makes sense. And if they're looking at arrangements of neurons and interactions in the brain, that's fine. Or similarly in the case of life, I mean, I've seen more than one book that attempts to explain how life emerges from a set of lifeless chemicals, and I think that could still qualify as strongly emergent. So, just to cut to how I think this should be done. So I think basically, strong emergence would be where we had powers of a whole that were not merely the powers of its parts, nor the mere aggregation of those powers of the parts, and the whole as those additional powers in virtue of a causal interaction and transformation of those parts. So everything I've said there, I think, allows it's perfectly naturalistically explicable. So I'll give one example. So water has power to put out flames, but neither of its parts have that power. In fact, the parts, hydrogen and oxygen, would actually fuel the flames rather than put flames out. So how can we have a whole that has a power that's not merely the aggregation of the powers of the parts? Well, it's because when those parts come together to form a water molecule, they interact with each other, they form a bond, and from the little chemical theory I know, it involves a sharing of an electron in the outer shell of the atoms. And this is a significant thing for the way that things behave. So that kind of transformation where the parts involve a change, that's where I think you get emergence. Let me just contrast it with another example where I don't think you get real emergence. So this is a Charlie Martin example. So if you imagine two right-angled triangles of the same size, you can arrange them in such a way that they form a square. And there, the whole has a property or power that the parts don't have, because the parts are triangular. Is that emergence? Well, I would hope not, because that would make emergence too cheap, really. We don't want it to be everywhere. That would just be putting things together in a certain arrangement. So there, that the parts undergo no change or transformation in their participation in that whole, whereas I think in the water case it does. Similarly, if you think of all the kind of candidate cases that we think could well be emergent, like mind emerging from mindless parts, life emerging from lifeless parts, meaning emerging from meaningless parts, and so on, then I think they are all cases where plausibly you have a causal interaction of those parts, and they change through their participation in the whole, and that's how it generates the higher level causal power. So that's it in brief.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think, of course, there's a lot to be elaborated on and perhaps worked out, and other problems that to be addressed. But do you worry that, or at least I might have the worry that this requirement that the parts be changed in some way by their participation in the whole might itself be very weak? Like, for example, well, the parts of some physical object are changed in some way in virtue of sort of forces that are present upon them, sort of gravitational, whatever else, in virtue of being part of the whole. And so they're changed in that way. And then it's also true that the whole might have properties distinct from any of its proper parts. Is that enough for strong emergence? It feels like that might still be too weak.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right that those are the sort of cases that have to be considered, but it's going to be important for me that you've got both conjuncts. So we do need a power of the whole that is not power of the parts. So we need that. We also need the part that the conjunct that the reason this power exists is because of the transformation. So, I mean, you could have a case where parts come together and there is some interaction of the kind you say, but if it's one that's inconsequential with respect to the powers of the whole, it doesn't generate a new phenomenon that's not a power of the parts or the mere aggregation of the powers of the parts, then it wouldn't count as emergent for me. But you're right, it's only, so far there's only one paper, and I'm hoping to do more work on this. It's exactly the kind of case that you'd need to test the theory and see whether it has to be made more robust. But I think it's already more robust than some of the theories of emergence that I read that really do, I think, make it look too weak, or it's too undefined, or sometimes it's defined purely negatively, which is a worry Yagwon Kim has about emergence. If you just sort of say it's non-reducibility, it's sort of defining it in a negative way. So it's some progress, about as much as you could make in one paper.
Fair enough. And I think you've also, another benefit you commented on either in that paper or in the talk you gave, I forget which, I'm remembering this from now. Another benefit of it is that it makes emergence consistent with sort of naturalism. You could have some sort of emergent phenomena that's natural. But why would someone take this necessarily to be a benefit? Perhaps someone thinks that there are sort of features that are not sort of naturalistic or reducible in that way, and that we want a notion of emergence that can sort of capture those. So what if someone thinks that mind really is this sort of radically different, non-natural thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you wanted to, some people are substance dualists or some kinds of dualists, and so yeah, they wouldn't see that as a problem. But I think it's unsatisfactory in some ways. I mean, one thing that was in that Chalmers definition you read out that I did agree with is the idea that the emergent phenomenon sort of arises from, it emerges out of its emergent base phenomenon. So you've got to have that base phenomenon there in order to get the emergent phenomena. So in the case of mind, you've got to have an organism, a body involving some kind of brain, that generates mind. Now, if you wanted to have a completely dualistic picture that allowed that mind doesn't have to emerge from that sort of physical arrangement, then that's okay. I mean, but it is a very different view, and while I'm not a real kind of heavy duty naturalist, partly because I'm just worried about exactly what naturalism means and how it's to be defined. But I think it's that's going to be my starting point, I think, because I'm trying to get away from that kind of CD broad idea that it just magically appears. I think if we can find how mind emerges from the brain and the rest of the body, that seems to me a perfectly worthy research program. It seems one that, well, I know not everybody agrees. There are some Mysterians who thinks that we can never solve this problem, but people who work on it, I don't think they're wasting their time. I think it's something that possibly could work out as a program. Similarly, the question of how life emerges from lifeless parts, I think we may be further down the line at working that theory out. So if we can, then I think that'll be a great success.
Absolutely. So I guess this is sort of a meta question about deciding between these different concepts. So like, why? It's not as if there is this well-defined thing, emergence, that different people are trying to give different accounts of. I take it, right? I mean,
yeah,
people have different things in mind. They're trying to capture different features of the world. So with that in mind, like, how are we deciding which of these concepts is better, so to speak? Is it just the sort of use of the concept, how well it fits in with our other commitments? Yeah.
Well, this is why I contrasted it with causation, a concept that's been around for millennia, or something that we can recognize as the concept of causation. Philosophers have discussed it for millennia. I think discussions of emergence are still in their relative infancy. Well, some people tell me that there is something in Aristotle that's quite like this, but I mean, that's a kind of general law, isn't it? That there's always going to be something in Aristotle that's like this. But one thing that I think we've got to be looking for with a concept that is kind of still up for grabs like this is that we want a serviceable concept, as I would call it. So we want a concept that's going to be useful. So what I think we mean by that is it's not a concept that applies to everything or almost everything, but it's not a concept that applies to almost nothing either. So it applies to some things. And I also think in this instance, we want a concept that once we've developed it, would be applicable to the sorts of things that we suspect might be emergent. So this is why I keep mentioning mind emerging from mindless parts, life emerging from lifeless parts, meaning emerging from meaningless parts, because I think these are good sort of prima facie, pre-theoretical candidates for emergent phenomena. So we've got some vague idea that there's something that the whole has that the parts don't have. So we've got that kind of vague idea. So I think this is a reasonable test for any future theory of emergence. Does it apply to only some things, first of all? So, there are some very weak notions of emergence that would just apply to too much. So we want it to apply to a select group of phenomena, and then further test, does it apply to the select group of phenomena that we think are sort of pre-theoretical candidates for emergence? So I was aiming for a view of emergence that would satisfy that requirement. That's one way I think we can proceed.
Right. So it's not that is that we have certain commitments that we want this sort of concept to satisfy, and sort of that provides a sort of a stepping stone for progress.
Yeah, and I mean, it really contrasts with the case of causation that we discussed earlier, didn't we? I mean, you asked me a question about, everybody has formed some causal judgment at some point. Everybody's got a rough idea of what causation is, and so we kind of constrained more by the platitudes, perhaps. Whereas I suspect that a lot of people have not got any idea of emergence, or the kind of emergence that philosophers talk about. They might say John emerged from the bathroom, but that means something completely different. So this is one where I think it's far more up for grabs. It's far more up to philosophers to shape this. We're not a slave to a whole bunch of platitudes or common usage. we're trying to fit our theory around that.
All right. Yeah, that's pretty helpful. So when you mentioned briefly mind as something that might be a candidate for an emergent phenomenon, that it emerges from mindless stuff, does that mean you're sort of open to either some sort of identity theory or functionalism or something like that in the philosophy of mind, or do you have any specific commitments in that regard?
Well, I started as a philosopher of mind, but it was 30 or more years ago.
Fair enough.
But one thing I would say on this, what I've said is entirely consistent with physicalism in some form. Now, some people find that alarming or counterintuitive. If I'm allowing that mind could be emergent, and I'm willing to allow top-down causation as well. So because the higher level causal powers can act on lower level phenomena, but that's maybe another story, not to get into. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the mere fact that it's emergent from the physical doesn't mean that it's not physical itself. It just means it's kind of higher level physical. So contrasting it with life emerging from lifeless parts, so we don't want to say that life is sort of non-physical. And indeed, there are plenty of people who work in the physical sciences who think that there are emergent phenomena within physics, within pure physics. So similarly, the a living human, well, any organism, it still can be physical, even though it's got some higher level causal powers that are not powers of the parts. So that's I think another thing that comes out of the naturalism and that theory of emergence. I don't think there's anything that shows that it means mind has to be non-physical. So then the issue of downward causation, I think, is not, it's not a question of the causal closure of the physical, because in this theory of emergence, mind is as physical as anything else. That, well, certainly the fact that it's emergent doesn't make it non-physical. So what's really at issue there is the causal closure of the microphysical. Because if you're someone who thought that all the microphysical laws determined everything, then you could say, well, there's no room for downward causation. But of course, if you are an emergentist, you will have already rejected the causal closure of the microphysical, because, well, certainly if you go with this theory that I'm offering, then you are allowing that there are higher level causal powers that are not, well, that have independence from the causal powers of their parts. So an emergentist has already rejected the causal closure of the microphysical. They're allowing that higher level physical powers can act. So I think it would be a consistent position to hold if you have this kind of emergence, that you can allow downward causation.
All right. And when you talk about sort of independence there, I think you've mentioned that or claimed that emergent phenomena are in some special way independent from their base, and even in a way that might falsify supervenience. Is this correct? Is that a view you're taking? I take this to be a
Yes,
more
but
controversial view.
yeah, but that's for a different reason. That follows from the account of causation that we discussed earlier. So the reason I would deny supervenience in the case of emergence is because it is a causal transformative model. It involves causal interactions of the parts giving rise to higher level powers. So if you are paying attention to what I said earlier, which I'm sure you all were, I allow that in causation there's a connection that's stronger than pure contingency but weaker than necessity. So of course what that means is that you could have two identical setups where you bring together the components, they start causally interacting. So there's no necessity that those two instances would produce the same outcome. You see what I mean? That's how you get failure of supervenience. Supervenience is going to require, if you had sort of two identical base level phenomena, they would give rise to the same emergent phenomena, which would indeed follow if you thought that, well, if you had this causal transformative model, but thought that causes necessitated their effects, then you're going to allow that these two identical causal processes must have the same outcome. But because we don't think causes necessitate their effects, then supervenience would fail. But there's still something significant there. I mean, people have had worries about supervenience for a long time anyway. It's far too weak, isn't it? I mean, I would still want to say that the base level phenomena produce the higher level phenomena on those occasions where the higher level phenomena does indeed exist. So there is still some kind of dependence relation, but it's just not the one strictly supervenience.
Speaking somewhat loosely, though, if we think of supervenience as a sort of vertical relation and causation as a horizontal one, couldn't someone think that sort of horizontal process might not be necessitating, but the vertical one is? Like, why would there be some connection there? You kind of understand what I'm getting at?
I think I understand what you're getting at, yeah, but I mean, yeah, I mean this again is where maybe a little bit unorthodox here. So an orthodox view might say that the relation between the parts and the whole is not a causal one, because causes precede their effects, whereas in the case of the relation between parts and wholes, we've got a dependence relation that holds simultaneously. So the whole is existing simultaneously with the parts existing. But again, you can see from what I've said earlier, there's no reason why I would have to deny that that's a causal relation, that the parts are causally producing the whole, because, as I said, I think of causation in terms of simultaneity rather than temporal priority. So there's going to be horizontal causal interactions, as you put it, but there's also going to be a vertical one that dependence is going to be a causal dependence. So I know that this is a controversial view in many ways, but not least the idea that dependence of the whole on the parts is going to be a causal dependence. So it's not merely sort of part-whole relations. So
Yeah.
you might think it's crazy, but I hope you can see how it all fits together.
I think I do. I mean, of course, someone might think that causation can be simultaneous, or maybe it is always simultaneous, but still not think that like constitution or some other relation like that is requires some sort of causal relation.
Sure, but I mean, I think it's clear that we need more than constitution anyway. And in this account of emergence, it's crucial that there be an interaction and transformation of the parts, so that they can form the emergent whole. So I don't think it would be, a kind of mere constitution relation. If you just think of, say, the way Lego bricks can be put together to form a whole. I don't know if you have Lego bricks over in North America.
Yeah, of course.
You do. Okay, I know it's a Danish invention, but because there you can make big holes that are going to have powers or properties that the parts don't have, but none of those individual Lego bricks undergoes any transformation through its participation in that whole. You see, so that's where I think you could have mere constitution, if I could put it that way. But I think when we're talking about emergence, I think we actually do need something more than just constitution.
And there is sort of a two-way street here in terms of causation. In the case of emergence, is the sort of emergent phenomena having some sort of causal influence on its parts in a way, or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so once you have high level causal powers, I mean, let's stick with the example of mind, and let's consider the implications for free will, which, you know, it's another topic I've done a little bit of work on. I think it puts us in a position to say quite rightly that I can choose to get up and leave the room, and I'm carrying my molecules out of the room, or I've decided to move them out of the room. So it's not my molecules carrying me out of the room. You know, it's I think the causation is at that high level, and that's what's doing the causal determining. I'm carrying my molecules out of the room. I think that's the right result. I mean, it might leave you with a few problems, like how to explain causal closure of the microphysical and so on. But I think it's certainly on its own, intuitively, the right result. I decide where my body goes rather than, say, my neurons deciding where my body goes.
Right. Although, I mean, in the same way, uh, your neurons are, in some sense, determining. Like the prior states of affairs, including your neurons, perhaps other things, in a way, determine the outcome of your actions. And so, is that correct?
No,
And what are the
no,
implications here for free will?
I wouldn't allow that. I mean, if your mind really was just the aggregation or addition of all the powers of the parts, all the powers of the individual neurons, then yes, I think I would allow what you just said, that the neurons are determining the thoughts, and so ultimately the neurons are determining your action. But this is where I think it's significant to allow that those neurons have interacted in such a way that it's given rise to a new causal power of the whole, that it then has an extent of causal freedom from that whole. Now, of course, the emergence still has to be there and still has to be ongoing. So if my brain was destroyed, then I would lose my power of free will. I could lose my power of thought and so on. But I think what's actually happening is that it's through those very complex interactions involving millions and billions of parts, it's given rise to a causal power that's independent from that to an extent. So there's no I think there's no meaningful law about neurons working that would then tell you anything about a decision that I make.
Right.
So that's the theory. Of course, I haven't got all the empirical detail, but that's the initial theory.
Right. And so Dio is wondering how this view gets situated in sort of the modern debates on free will. Is it consistent with the sort of libertarianism, or not?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I am a libertarian, and again, that's something to which I was converted relatively recently. By which I mean in the last 10 years, converted by my co-author Rani Anyam. So back when I started, I was going to do my PhD on free will, and I was going to be a determinist. Then after a few years, I realised that most people were compatibilists, and I thought maybe that is the way to go. So I was just sort of content, thought that the problem had been solved. Whereas then I realised that, or it was explained to me, that if you put together these certain views about causation and causal power and emergence, that it does give you a libertarian view. So in the course of my career, at one time or another, I've held all three of the main positions. Sometimes it takes you a while to get there, doesn't it, in philosophy? And I don't think we should be afraid of changing our minds when we need to. So, yeah, I would classify this as a form of libertarianism. What I've been talking about, emergence, isn't the whole picture on free will. I think it's only part of the picture. I think there's lots more other things you would have to say before you had a full theory of free will. But I think it is, an important part of the jigsaw.
Okay, and so something like the principle of alternative possibilities, that's something that's affirmed or satisfied on your view?
Well, it is fairly trivially within my own metaphysics, because there are always going to be alternate possibilities, and I think the difficulty for free will has always been to reconcile that principle with another principle that we've got to have ultimate authorship of our own actions for them to count as free. So I've got another paper called Freedom and Control, I think it's in American Phil Quarterly, I think, which tries to reconcile these two desiderata on a theory of free will. So there's a simple way of explaining it. Consider the golfer. J.L. Austin had this example of a golfer. Now, suppose I'm taking a golf shot. I'm on the green. I'm just trying to make a putt, but maybe a fairly long putt. And what I'm trying to do is exercise all my causal powers in a way to succeed in my goal, to get the ball in the hole. Now, suppose I do that. I try and do everything right, and I take the shot, and it indeed goes in the hole. Well, I think it's absolutely right that I claim responsibility for that. I win the trophy. It was me exercising my causal powers that led to the ball going in. Now, I think that isn't compromised by the fact, which is consistent with this kind of dispositional tendency modality view I've been talking about. So it's quite possible that something could have intervened and stopped the ball going in. I didn't have control over every alternate possibility that could have happened. So, I could have taken exactly that shot, and a gust of wind could have come along at the last moment, or a squirrel could have run along and stolen the ball before it got in the hole. So I think we can have responsibility for our actions, even though we don't have control over every possible thing that could have prevented that action being successful. So alternate possibilities on this kind of dispositional view of the world, that's fairly easy to get, because, as I've said, when you strike a match, it might just not light. So once you've got a world of causation that doesn't involve necessitation, then alternate possibilities are going to come on fairly cheap. And I think the real challenge for free will is showing how in that kind of world you can still act freely, you can still have successful actions for which you have responsibility. So that's more a case where this view of dispositional modality, which we've touched on earlier, I think is going to be play an important part in the story of free will.
Oh yeah, maybe the key issue here is going to be what sort of modality we're adopting. But what if someone were to say that in the case of the match, or in the case of the golf ball, there just is no chanciness involved. So take some particular match, given some prior state of the world and sort of laws of nature, if there are such things, there's only one way it can go. It's either it's going to get lit, for example, or if the state were such that that's entailed, or it won't get lit. But what do you think? How do we get free will on that when the outcomes of our actions are similarly determined in that way?
Yeah, well, I think the answer I should give there is that I don't think our world is a deterministic world. I mean, part of the reason I'm a libertarian is because I am an incompatibilist now.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, if the world is entirely determined, then I think that compromises our free will. Having said that, so I actually don't think that the principle of alternate possibilities is actually decisive. I think what really counts for free will is that we're acting on our own causal powers. And so there are plenty of cases discussed by Frankfurt and I think John Locke, where somebody's in a position where they don't realize that there's no alternate possibility anyway. But in those cases, I think you could still act freely. So, like the person who freely decides to remain in a locked room, mistakenly believing that the door's unlocked and they could leave anytime they want. I think that could still be. I think that would satisfy one of our main requirements for free will, because I think the main requirement is that you're acting on your own causal powers. What then complicates it for me is what I think a causal power is going to involve something less than necessitation anyway. So I'm still going to have to insist that it's a non-deterministic world.
Right. Fair enough. So Yuri actually had a follow-up question on that he wanted to ask. If you want to unmute, you can ask.
Hey, what's up? It's nice to meet you,
Hello.
Mumford. It's very nice. I was curious. You say that you hold to like libertarian free will, but I was just curious. Do you how do you like? Because I held that view in the past as well. But I'm curious. An issue that I haven't been able to overcome is how you deal with like the argument from randomness. And I was curious if you had an objection to that or had a different take on that.
So do you mean the view in Hume that and others that if it's randomly decided what you do, then that's not free will either?
No. So the idea is that imagine if we have two agents, right? We have A agent and B agent, and then the A agent likes vanilla ice cream, right? So A agent likes vanilla ice cream, but B agent likes chocolate ice cream, right? So under the argument from randomness, under libertarian free will, it would just be that it would be reducible to the agent, right, on what ice cream he or she desired, right? But like the problem is that under libertarian free will, there's no explanation or account of why the agent chose A rather than B, A being vanilla ice cream and B being chocolate ice cream. So I was just curious if you had an account of that.
What? So are those agents choosing the ice cream that they like?
So there's two ice cream flavors, right? You have
Yeah,
chocolate ice cream and you have vanilla ice cream, right?
yeah, and they both chose the one they like.
Right, yeah. And the question is to the libertarian is what explains why that agent chose vanilla ice cream rather than, chocolate ice cream?
Right, and what's wrong with the explanation that that's the ice cream that they liked?
Well, it seems
I'm not asking that question facetiously, because I think the answer is it doesn't so much matter where your own tendencies or dispositions come from. The fact that there's no explanation for why you just like vanilla ice cream, I think, isn't an impediment to you acting freely when you choose vanilla ice cream. So I don't know if that's the issue, but I mean, I think there's plenty of dispositions that we might just have, which it's just we were born that way. Another example, I don't know if you've ever seen any film of sometimes you can throw a baby into a swimming pool and it just starts swimming because it's kind of instinctive. Now the baby doesn't want to go in the swimming pool. It's screaming, it's trying to back away, doesn't like it, but it just starts swimming. Now, the fact that that disposition was acquired involuntarily, I think, doesn't preclude you subsequently acting freely when you choose to exercise that disposition. I mean, similarly, I was given the disposition to speak English rather than German or French, when I was a child growing up in England. So I didn't voluntarily acquire that disposition. I just grew up speaking English, but it doesn't mean that I'm not free when I subsequently choose to exercise that disposition. So was that the issue you were getting at? Was it something
Yeah.
slightly different?
Thanks for answering that. That's an interesting view, because like a lot of people, they either try to like say how like holding a view like that is question begging in a way. But if you're just saying, right, that like that libertarian free will is almost like held independent or irrespective of yourself, right, and that your decisions are just that way because of like how you were brought up, then like I don't see like an issue with that, I guess. So thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I mean, I could say just a little bit more on it. I mean, I think what I think is going to be really important in the account of free will. So this is another element that I've not mentioned yet, and it's a controversial element, but I think it is significant that we have this causal power. We have an ability to think about our own thoughts, so we can have higher order desires, higher order thoughts. So we could have a disposition, suppose I'd been brought up with a disposition to do something that I now think is wrong or bad. I don't know, maybe I'd been influenced in my youth to take up smoking tobacco, and then I have a higher order desire to not have that desire to smoke tobacco. I think that's an important part of freedoms, that we're not just acting on our first order desires, but because we have these emergent mental causal powers, we've got an ability to think about our own desires and decide whether we want to exercise them. So in the swimming case, I may have involuntarily acquired the disposition to swim, but now I can think about that disposition and think, I'm glad I've got it and I want to use it. Similarly, in the disposition to speak English. But there could be some dispositions I decide I don't want those. So I know not everybody likes this idea of higher order powers and so on, but I think it's significant. I mean, say a computer cannot decide not to follow its programming. And if the sort of dispositions we gain growing up could be likened to our programming, then we have this special ability that we can choose not to follow our programming. We can choose to do something else, and these higher order thoughts that we have, they're governed by normative considerations about what we ought to do, not just what we're disposed to do.
I actually agree
So
with
I
like.
think there is.
Oh, go ahead. I'm
Yeah,
sorry about that.
no, go
Oh,
on, you go on. I've talked a lot.
Oh, I was just saying I actually agree with that, but like I guess where I'm confused is that I always took like like I believe in free will, but I just don't hold like I don't hold to libertarian free will. But it seems like I've always heard libertarians always like espouse that like the that there isn't anything independent that causes us to make certain decisions. It's something innate with them as like an agent, right? But like as like a because I'm
Right.
a compatibilist and I hold the free will as well, but just not in a libertarian sense. But everything the way you're describing free will seems to match up with like my understanding of what I personally hold. And so maybe I just had a misunderstanding of what libertarian free will was.
No, I don't know about that, because I think the reason it sounds right to you and what you've said sounds right to me is that maybe we're motivated by a similar consideration, which when you first asked your question, it's the reason I went back to Hume. So Hume had a point, and it figures in Peter van Inwagen's essay on free will. I'm sure you probably know that because it's such a famous book, but he's saying sort of, if my actions are necessitated, then that's not free will. But if my actions are a matter of pure chance, this is the Humean point, then that's not free will either. So Hume uses that point to motivate a form of compatibilism. And there's an idea that free will is sort of incoherent without determinism. You can only have free will if there is some determinism, because we don't want that sort of realm of pure chance. Now, given what I've talked to you today about my view on causation and this idea that it's something more than pure chance but less than necessity, maybe you can see how I'm going to use that to solve Van Inwagen's dilemma, that you're right. If it's necessity, it's not free will. If it's pure chance, it's not free will. But causal powers are neither of those. There's something in between, a tendency towards certain actions. And as causal agents exercising our causal powers, then we partake of that same dispositional modality.
Well, thank you for taking the time to answer that. That was a very good answer. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right, great. So I'll just remark at this point, we've been going for about an hour and a half. I'm just wondering if you have any sort of time constraints, because we're free to go on for longer if you're available. But
I am available, yes. The only thing is if it gets to my bedtime. But I can tell you if I'm getting tired. I'm happy to continue.
sounds great. And thanks again so much for taking the time to
You're
answer our
welcome.
questions.
I'm
So
enjoying
I think,
it.
awesome. So I think Doug had a question. If you wanted to get on mic, you could do so.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question, and I'm not sure if this was answered or asked before, but what would, if you have a disposition, what would explain why a disposition instantiates in one instance or is actualized in one instance but not another? So for example, if you like with the match, because somebody could say that, well, when we talk about dispositions, we could talk about them in this kind of very coarse-grained, very kind of generalized way. However, when we get down to the details, maybe when I struck a match in a particular position and under a particular set of conditions, it actually isn't disposed to be lit under those conditions, but only in others. And so if I strike it in those conditions, it will always light, right? It's like necessitated. So my question is, what would explain, in your view, why a match didn't light in a particular situation if it was disposed to generally?
Yeah, I mean it's a really good and difficult question. And I've got a few different things to say about that, because it's it is quite a deep question, so it can't have a superficial answer. So one thing I could say is, to an extent, I'm going to agree with you, right? To an extent. So when the match fails to light, it might be because a gust of wind comes. So that there could be an explanation of it, and then there's a few further things we can say of it. So one thing is, I don't think that kind of explanation would threaten the denial of necessity of causation that I started with, if it's just that kind of consideration. Now, some people find this alarming, because that kind of question often goes down the line that, well, if we could describe the case in enough detail and include everything that's operating, then that total state necessitates the effect. Now, I'll come back to that. But just to stick with the first point, so suppose we're going to say, well, strike the match and there's a gust of wind, and I'm claiming that that doesn't threaten my argument against necessity. So I'm arguing that causes don't necessitate their effects. Now, what I need for that is simple point that the way we understand necessity as philosophers, we say that if A necessitates B, then whenever A occurs, B occurs. And causation doesn't behave like that. It doesn't behave like philosophers would standardly understand necessity, because here we've got a case where we have A, the striking of the match, but we don't have B, the lighting of the match. And it's because there's some other state of affairs, C, that gets in the way, an interferer. Now, some people seem to think this possibility of interference just immediately and automatically destroys this argument against necessity, but I don't think it does, because as we understand necessity, So if this being water necessitates its H2O, as some people think, then you can add any further premise to that, and it's still the case that if it's water, it's H2O. So if it's water and today is Thursday, then it's H2O. If it's water and today is Friday, then it's still H2O. If it's water and I'm wearing a hat, then it's still H2O. So I don't think the possibility of sort of identifying the interferer that actually stops the cause producing its effect explains or defeats the argument against necessity. In fact, I would say it's part of the explanation as to why causes don't necessitate their effects, because they're all subject to the possibility of interference. Now,
Well, I wanted to just briefly ask, but it seems like in this case we might consider it that it's not you striking the match that causes it to light. It's you striking the match in conjunction with other causes that is the real cause of its lighting, right? So it's like this big conjunctive cause, right? So
okay. So yeah, I was going to come to that. That's sort of the second part. So I've dealt with the first part, first thing I wanted to say. Second part. So yes, suppose you think there is a big conjunction of causes, and we're still discussing this question of does the cause necessitate the effect? Now, suppose you say, okay, so I'm going to describe the cause in enough detail, and I'm going to conjoin it with all the kind of surrounding things that could possibly involved, and I'm going to say that huge cause is what we should call the cause, and that indeed necessitates its effect. Well, I'm not going to concede that, because you've just got a huge cause followed by an effect, and I'm not denying that the cause produces the effect. The question is whether that huge cause necessitated the effect. Right now, I'm not going to allow that, but what I might say instead is, if we want to know whether C produces E, this cause produces the effect, then we've got to think of a sort of test of necessity. We can't just assume it. I'm not just going to give my opponent, I'm not just going to allow them to assume the very thing I'm denying. Okay, so what the things I've been talking about a few moments ago propose one possible test of necessity, and I think it's a fairly good test of necessity. So I'm saying I could give you all that big cause, but I still think it's a possibility that if you add all that plus some further thing, it could stop that effect from occurring. Now, some people at this stage just try to find some automatic way of ruling out this possible further addition. Some people have said to me, well, perhaps the cause is like the whole universe, and there is nothing more that could come and interfere with that cause and stop its producing its effect. But I actually think that kind of gives up the game on my opponent's part, because it's almost like a tacit admission that if there were something else, it could stop this cause from producing the effect. And that's all I need to show that the cause doesn't necessitate the effect. So these strategies, I've heard various forms of this strategy that are trying to prevent me from adding something further to this whole big cause. It's kind of an admission, I think. It's almost like when an athlete when an athlete refuses to take a drug test, it's kind of seen as a kind of admitting that they're going to fail the test, that they're guilty. So similarly, if my opponent tries to find a strategy of stopping me from adding any possible further interferer to the cause, because they know it could stop the effect, it's kind of admission that causes don't necessitate their effects. So yeah, there's even further aspects to that question, but I think that's probably enough to just sort of challenge the initial objection against the argument.
All right, I think we'll move on, because I had a question about laws of nature, and you have a paper where you advocate sort of eliminativism about laws, given
Yes.
a sort of problem built into our core concept of laws. Is this, well, first, could you sort of expound upon this view briefly, and is this a view that you still maintain?
Yeah, it is pretty much. So, so this is from my 2004 book, Laws in Nature.
Right.
So I got quite interested in a kind of pure metaphysical question of what a law of nature actually is. What kind of being it is, or does it have any being? Is it a thing? So this is a sort of question I think a pure metaphysician is going to ask. So we see science seems to invoke laws all over the place. But I saw also some philosophers did. So if you take David Armstrong's metaphysics, he's a realist about laws in nature, and they do quite a bit of work in his overall metaphysic. So I wanted to know what these things were, what substance they had, what being they had, if any, and if that's not a category mistake. And so the book had 3 parts to it. The first part was basically looking at descriptive or deflationary accounts. So Humeans will invoke laws, but they're not things that have any being themselves. So you could just be a descriptivist. So you might think a law is just a description of the regularities. Or if you're a Lewisian, you might think the law is a summary or systematization, a best possible systematization of the world's history. You know, that kind of thing. But I'd say these are deflationary accounts or descriptive accounts of laws. They are just describing the history of the world or the regularities of the world. And the laws in that case don't do any governing. They don't do anything. They don't govern their instances. So in that sense, yeah, that would be an elimination of laws. Then they certainly don't have any being. And then in part 2, I looked at what I called nomological realism, those rather brave attempts to give some substance to laws, to treat them as if they are real things. David Armstrong's view being, I think, the main one that I talked about. I think I also talked about laws in Brian Ellis. And there I think that is problematic to say exactly what they are, how they govern their instances, and I thought there was no plausible account of how they were both existent and would govern anything or change anything, you know. So if these laws were real things, how do they operate? How do they influence the behavior of individual things, you know? So if you think of the gravitation law as an existent, how does it govern the motions of particular bodies, you know? So that's where I think nomenological realists didn't have a plausible account of that. So got to the end of part 2 of the book with a sort of problem in that, you know, there's lots of talk about laws, but nobody's got a real plausible account of them having any kind of reality. But then in part 3 of the book, I argued that if you have metaphysics of causal powers, surprise, surprise, then you never needed laws in the first place. You know, so first of all, laws couldn't do the work that people wanted them to do. But second, there's no work for them to do anyway, because things have individual causal powers that determine their behavior. Now, there's some detailed work to do, because you might worry, like, well, how come all things of the same kind behave in roughly the same kind of way? Doesn't that need some general governing law? So I try to explain things like that as well. So basically, yes, your characterization is right. So I think there's lots of talk of laws, but I don't think it's a serious kind of part of the machine that kind of explains how our world works. So I mean, it's one thing I've liked to do in my career in the metaphysics I do. So I would sort of describe the metaphysics I do as metaphysics of science. I'm interested in some of the fundamental concepts at an abstract level, that are used in scientific explanation. And basically, I think if you've got powers, and it's going to allow causation and various other things, but that you don't need laws of nature besides, because they're not going to add anything to the picture. And you know, and even if you thought that they did, you've got this very difficult task of explaining how they actually do anything, how they actually do any work. So that's why I'm an eliminativist about laws.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was also thinking, because you have a 2005 paper kind of summarizing this point. I think it's called like Laws of Lawlessness. Yes. Yeah. So what if someone grants that, okay, these laws aren't really doing any work themselves, they're not really governing things, but they're, again, just kind of take the descriptivist approach, they're kind of useful descriptions, sort of summaries of relations of events and stuff like that, that aren't really part of the fabric of the world, but are useful for describing it. Is that something you're opposed to?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't oppose that, because I mean, I think basically what a law is a description of the causal powers of kinds of entity. So it's causal powers that are doing the kind of work. So again, if we go back to, say, the gravitation law, what I think that's doing is describing the powers of things, that physical objects attract each other in to the extent that the gravitation law describes. So the kind of summary or description of those causal powers in the formula, the gravitational equation, is going to be perfectly useful if because it is a true description. I sort of briefly alluded to the kind of worry that people have about, well, how come every physical object is going to attract every other physical object in exactly to the extent that the gravitation law describes? Doesn't that suggest that there is some kind of overarching law of nature that's determining that? That's the kind of objection. But here's where I, to an extent, leaned on Brian Ellis's dispositional essentialism. So I think basically there isn't a problem as to why everything of the same kind behaves in roughly the same way, because I think what's really happening is that it's because things are behaving in roughly the same way that we group them together in the same kind. So if you see that sort of turning the tables there, turning the tables. So it's not my move, it's Brian Ellis's, but I think it's quite useful. So it would give you a conclusion that's what it is to be a physical thing, is to be disposed to behave as the gravitation law says. So if something, if there were Cartesian spirits or something, part of what it was that would make them non-physical would be that they didn't act in accordance with the gravitation law. So that's the position.
Do you think it might be? Yeah, that's really helpful. But I mean, do you think it might be a bit optimistic in a way to think that all proposed laws might be cashed out in terms of powers? Like, for example, if we take, I don't know, the conservation of energy, or the evolution of the wave function according to the Schrodinger equation, like these things. Do you think that will be successful there, or do you think?
Well, I don't know, and I don't know enough physics that I'm going to say that, but I think I think part of the problem is that the things that are called laws of nature are a real mixed bag. So sometimes it involves these sort of fundamental principles, which, for all we know, could be a disposition of the universe as a whole, for instance. So I think partly the debate gets hampered by the fact that all sorts of different things get lumped together that are called laws, which are sometimes, I don't know, more fundamental things like principles. Equations, I'm not sure. I mean, nobody's ever going to think, I think, of an equation as something that exists, unless you're a Platonist who thinks that sort of mathematical entities exist. I think the question is about what truth that equation is describing, and that's where I think, I'm not going to rule out the possibility that it could be something about the fundamental way in which the universe is disposed. Similarly, something like the direction of entropy. It's that seems to be just a very basic and fundamental fact about the way our universe works. So, yeah, maybe I'm optimistic, but I'm happy to keep it as my working hypothesis for now.
Fair enough. And so I think we had another voice question from Shinichi. If you want to, maybe you can do so.
Hi, hello again. I had a question about, first of all, I think in a few places you affirm there being these sorts of like bare dispositions, and you give some examples. I just wanted to see if you still held to that view, and also what you thought about people who think that all properties are dispositional, or at least all properties can be thought of as dispositional.
Yeah, well, on the latter question, yeah, I'm a pan-dispositionalist. Now, I think that position is sometimes misunderstood. Some people take it as meaning that everything is a disposition. But for me, that claim is restricted to properties. So I think all properties are dispositional. Now, I would say all genuine properties. So I don't think a property is just the meaning of any old term. So there are some things that people might offer as candidate properties that I think are not genuine properties. I think there are some naturalistic constraints on what counts as a property. So say if you had a disjunctive predicate, I don't think there's a property corresponding to that disjunctive predicate, if you see what I mean. So within some naturalistic constraints, and my properties are not as sparse as everybody's properties. So it doesn't mean just the fundamental properties. An example I've often talked about is sphericity, which I think is a nice sort of well-known macroscopic property. And I would see that as a bundle of causal powers. So it's a power to roll in a straight line down an inclined plane, a power to feel smooth in your hand, a power to leave a circular indentation in soft sand, and so on and so forth. Sounded a bit like Zizek then. So on and so forth. So yeah, I think all properties are dispositional. Some people have objections to that, but I think they can. Well, the ones I've heard of, I think can be answered. So do I allow then there's some bare dispositions? Well, yeah. I mean that kind of comes out of it trivially. I mean, what. I used to worry about, well, this property has a categorical base, and, do all properties have categorical bases? Could there be spin, charge, and mass of subatomic particles that don't have categorical bases? But now I'm a bit more relaxed about that, because I think those sort of categorical base properties, whatever they are going to ultimately turn out to be dispositional anyway.
Sorry, could I interrupt really fast if you don't mind?
Yes.
Yes. So I guess one thing to ask is, so you give this sort of famous ungrounded argument, which is, in a sentence, of course you can explain it better, that every dispositional property is going to be grounded in some property that's not itself. And if we are also saying that all the genuine properties are dispositional, are there any concerns about kind of infinite levels of properties, if you understand what I mean?
I do understand exactly what you mean, but I don't I don't know that we have to be concerned about it. Just because I see no a priori reason why the world couldn't be infinitely complex, so kind of gunky world where there's parts all the way down. I don't see any a priori reason why it has to be infinite parts. And I'm not sure that there's any sort of a posteriori reason either for either hypothesis. So it seems something undecidable. I mean, it's a rather old point. I think Bertrand Russell made it that for every particular that we believe to be simple, it could have hidden complexity within it. So we can never know for sure that something is simple.
Right.
So yeah, so I'm not too worried just because I can't see a reason why the world couldn't be infinitely complex. I'm not saying that it is, because I don't see a reason why it couldn't have simples at the bottom of everything.
Right. So when you say
Either.
complex, do you mean, because I mean it in the sense of sort of vertically. So like in terms of there being infinite levels of ground, so to speak. So like if all the properties are dispositional and every dispositional property is grounded by some property other than itself, then I guess you could make the argument, though of course you might not accept it, that that entails like infinitely many levels of grounding.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there are arguments to be had about whether, if so, would it mean anything was grounded ultimately? But I think if you kind of accept the possibility of real infinite series, then you might just say, yes, that is a possible scenario.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that there are simples, but it's not something that we can know for sure. I mean, it might sound counterintuitive that the world has infinite complexity all the way down, but that's all I've got to go on for rejecting it. I've got no argument for rejecting it.
All right, thanks for that. I wanted to switch gears a little bit and ask a question about, or relating to a paper you had from 2007 on negative truth and falsehood.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
well, I've just finished a book on absence and nothing, on the philosophy of what there is not. So I've revisited this issue and the whole issue of non-entities and negative entities.
oh, awesome! I'll have to check that out, and maybe you'll have some things to say that you discuss in that.
Yeah, so it should be out later this year.
Awesome. So I'll just ask my question anyway, or I guess I'll start by making sure that I understand the general conclusion here. Is it's a sort of eliminativism again, in that, well, we're dealt this problem with, well, how are these negative statements true? And the answer is just to say they aren't. They aren't true at all. I guess that's one way to deal with any sort of problem, in that we can say, well, there's this particular commitment we have, and there's these sort of problem cases generated by that commitment. Well, we don't get the problems if we deny the commitment, and so that's sort of way out. But in every case that seems to come at some cost, the question is whether it's a cost worth paying. And I think a lot of people will say that if, for example, I say it's true that, I don't know, there isn't an alien in the call right now. If that's not a truth, then that's a serious cost. So what? So what would you say on the sort of that sort of concern that it's not really, it's too big of a price to pay?
Well,
to deny it.
Yeah, I mean, this is where my subsequent work on, I think, will help. I'm hoping you find a much more refined account than in that 2007 paper. But So I've been doing work on denial, for instance, denial as opposed to affirmation or assertion. And my view on this is that denial is primary. Primary in relation to the word not. So there is assertion, which I think is appropriate when you're wanting to say how the world is. When you're wanting to say how the world is not, you use this word not. But I think in respect of the word not, denial is primary. Denial is what we're trying to do. So I'm going to deny there's an alien on this call. And the accepted way of doing it is to use the word not. So not as the indicator of denial. The mistake then, I think, occurs when we take that not as if it's something that can be asserted. Because I think that denial and assertion have distinct functions. And the functions of denial are not just the negation of the functions of assertion. So it's not simply that denial and assertion are kind of got symmetrical functions and one's just got the negation in front of it. I think they are. There's a number of ways in which assertion and denial are distinct. So again, from a kind of purely philosophical, regimenting view, I'm not going to go around correcting people's usage in the street when they use the word not. But I think the problem is when philosophers concerned with, say, a correspondence theory of truth believe that they're asserting that something is not the case, because then that immediately generates what historically was called the paradox of negative judgment. But now with the advent of truthmaker theory, we know it as the problem of truth makers for negative truths. So what makes it true that there's not a hippopotamus in this room? Philosophers have considered this question for at least a century. You could argue it's maybe back in Plato's Sophist as well. And they've struggled to come up with it. What it is in the world that makes it true that there's not a hippopotamus in the room. So it could well be that by making this initially linguistic move, that the not is used as a shorthand for denying that there's a hippopotamus in the room. So we put the not in there and then start thinking that we're asserting something is not the case. That leaves us with this paradox of negative judgment. So instead, I'm claiming that if I deny there's a hippopotamus in the room, that doesn't give me any commitment to a way that the world is. And that's the problem. Assertions are committing to a way that the world is. And there it's an ontological commitment to the truth maker of that truth, if you like, if you're a truth maker theorist. And that's what we don't have when we use the word not. But I think that's entirely correct, because not is primarily an indicator of denial. So that's one of the things in my book on absence and nothing. The book also considers perception of absence, causation by absence, whether negative properties are real, whether mere possibilities are real, and a host of problems are around negatives that I'd worried about for a number of years, and thought I'd bring them all together into one systematic treatment. So quite excited about it.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. I'll have to take a look at that for sure. So then the basic idea is that, well, when we're asserting and when we're denying, these really are different sorts of speech acts, if you were, or activities.
Yeah.
And the mistake comes from thinking that, or from applying a sort of analysis to assertion equally to denial. When we have assertion, we're committed to these things. Like
it's trying to treat a denial as if it is an assertion. So in the book, I draw up a table of assertion and denial that shows the kind of differences they have in as functions. So, for instance, I think denial is sort of conventionally responsive. So when you're denying something, it's typically in response to an assertion. Right now, it doesn't have to be. This is only a convention, and conventions can be broken. But it's unusual to start a conversation with a denial, and when you do so, it's usually because there's a kind of shared, tacit, understood kind of background assertion that you're talking about. Hugh Price has got some good work on this, which I discuss in the book. But another thing is that denial is sort of immediately indicative of incompatibility. So suppose I'm walking to see John, and I come to his house and I see him in his back garden, and I knock on the door and Jane answers, and I say, "Oh, I've come to see John," and she says, "John's in the bathroom." Right now, I've seen him in his back garden. Now there, I've got a choice. I could assert, in response to Jane, I could first assert John is in the garden, or I could instead deny that John is in the bathroom. So, and I could, using the word not, I could just say John is not in the bathroom. Now, this is a sort of question raised by Hugh Price, but it's a case I discuss. And Price says, what you really should do as a philosopher, you should deny that John is in the bathroom, because if you answer an assertion with another assertion, then the incompatibility then has to be inferred, usually by invoking another premise, such as it's not possible to both be in the garden and in the bathroom. Whereas if I deny what Jane has asserted, the incompatibility is registered instantly and immediately. It doesn't have to go via an additional premise. So this is just one way in which I think denial has different function from assertion, and it's part of a list I've drawn up of about a dozen differences. So it's sort of saying that it's wrong to treat denial as if it's just an assertion of a negation.
All right. And so, but what about the following sort of reply that someone might take in response to these sorts of problems and others? Is just to deny that there are truth makers. What if someone took a different view of truth, on which we don't need truth makers to make sense of it?
Well, I think the consideration, although it's put in terms of truth makers, is a very broad consideration. I mean, all you need is something as broad as truth depends on being. People used to say truth supervenes on being, but I already said a while ago as to why supervenience isn't always useful. But I mean, so basically any realist theory of truth, I think, is going to have this issue in one way or another. Of course, there are other theories of truth, a coherence theory of truth or something, which might not have this problem, I would concede. But I think the problem is general enough to be worth considering. Because any view in which truth depends upon the way the world is, so you've got a problem with statements that are not about the way the world is, but about the way the world is not. You've always got a question about, well, then what makes them true, and of course we don't want to. I should have set some broader context for this. So the plan of the book is in a broadly Parmenidean project. So Parmenides is the philosopher who said that nothing is not, that nothing is not something. He also said you can't even speak about nothing. So I've got a chapter on empty reference as well. So some people, in response to this problem, have just said, well, maybe negation is a feature of the world. Maybe there are negative facts. Bertrand Russell allowed that there were negative facts. So I'm trying to solve all these problems involving nothingness without ever reifying nothingness. So it's in the spirit of Parmenides. Can we explain causation by absence without ever saying absences are real things, so real causally active things? That's one possible answer, but I'm kind of ruling out, or trying to see how far we can take that project of Parmenides to give an account of the world without nothingnesses or absences as real things.
All right. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes. I don't want to keep you too long, but I had a couple more questions to get to, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
So one is a sort of meta-philosophy question. What do you think is the purpose or the utility of philosophy as a discipline? Sort of general, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it's maybe not something I've thought too much about, because philosophy came to me fairly naturally and it just seemed interesting and important. But I have sometimes sort of been head of department, and I've been dean of the arts faculty at one point, and I've often had parents concerned about their children coming to study philosophy, and what good will it do them. So I have had to think a bit about, as well as any intrinsic value it has, which I've got no doubt it has massive intrinsic value. Is there some extrinsic value as well? And I think absolutely so. I mean, I think philosophy is in many ways the greatest discipline, because I think it's one that has a sort of optimum combination of rigor and precision matched with kind of artistic creativity, because we have to come up with arguments. We have to create arguments. That philosophy is a creative process, and yet it's also got or can have the same level of rigor as mathematics or physics. So I think it's no surprise that many employers recognize philosophy graduates as some of the best, because they have this combination where they can write long essays, they can write discursive pieces, but they can handle symbolism and precision and so on. So if you are just talking about extrinsic value, I think it's got that. I think it's great training for the mind, and I think philosophical problems are real problems, and we're right to look for the sort of philosophical techniques that allow us to answer, or at least attempt to answer some of these really difficult but important questions that are definitely important to us. So I think it's got both intrinsic and extrinsic value.
All right. And just to wrap up, I would be remiss if I didn't ask anything about the philosophy of sport. So just a sort of general question. Why do you think the philosophy of sport is important, and what can people who enjoy sports learn from the philosophy of sport?
Yeah. Well, at first I thought of philosophy of sport as a bit of a sideline, because if you spend decades working on metaphysics, you're going to get interested in other things, or you might just want to do a bit of philosophy that's a relief, a different kind of topic altogether. And I think that might be why I initially got interested in philosophy of sport. But as I did it, kind of inevitably I ended up bringing my metaphysics into it, and understanding it from a metaphysical point of view. Now, a lot of philosophy of sport, it's a very diverse field. There's aesthetics of sport, so it's kind of a branch of aesthetics. Ethics in sport is a huge field, so it deals with questions like why is it wrong to take performance-enhancing drugs and so on. But I was always concerned a bit more with the kind of ontological and existential questions in sport. So I think topics like causation are absolutely relevant to sport. Sport is always going to involve causal interactions and the athletes making things happen. I've also got really interested in kind of existential questions. So I think in sport, there's often a really interesting playing off of self and other. So often sport's about yourself. It's about kind of maximizing your own capacities and then manifesting them on the day of the event. But then there's also a huge sense of other, because there's competition and you've got to beat the other person as well. So I think it tells us a lot. I mean, I'm going to sound like an existentialist here or something, but I think it tells us a lot about our embodied nature and the kind of joy that we have in exercising our own causal powers. There's a really significant thing about sport is that we're basically arguing over nothing, aren't we? I mean, what does it matter if the ball goes in that net rather than that net? You know, it doesn't really matter. The goals in sport are all quite inconsequential. So why are we playing it? It rather suggests that we're kind of doing it for the intrinsic value and the pleasure that we have in maximizing our capacities and then manifesting those capacities. So I think there's quite a lot that sport teaches us about life as well. I think there's lots of lessons in sport that we can take to our sort of regular lives outside sport. So competitiveness, for instance, I mean, that's not unique to sport. Some people are very competitive and they want to get in the top philosophy journals. They want to be a better philosopher than everybody else and so on. So, yeah, lots of interesting questions in sport.
Absolutely. And I mean, as much as I'd like to explore some more of those with you right now, I don't think we should keep you much.
No, that's yeah, that's fine. We've been going for quite a while, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much. It's been, I think we're past almost at the 2.5 hour mark, so it's been absolutely wonderful to have you here and take the time to answer all these questions.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it. It's a pleasure to discuss philosophy with people.
Awesome. Have a good one.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot then.